So welcome everyone to this presentation on the wonderful world of salt marshes and why we should be uh, giving them lots of love and protect them, and what they can do for us, the ecosystem services they can provide, especially the ecosystem service of carbon storage, which was the focus of my thesis. I'm going to be talking a little bit about my own research in that respect. And as I said before, I'm going to try to keep it to 30 minutes. There's always the danger, because it's one of my favorite topics, that I overshoot that a little bit, but I'll try to have an eye on the time. There's a link to my thesis in the chat, which is available for download on ResearchGate if anyone wants to go into more detail afterwards. And you should all be seeing now the wonderful world of salt marshes and why we should protect them. So that's one of the salt marshes I worked at. And for me, studying marine environmental protection, I did not expect to be spending my thesis work on a meadow. I was imagining something with slightly more water, probably. Salt marshes are not really the habitat that most people associate with studying a marine-related master's. And they're often a little bit overlooked. They're a bit of an unspectacular habitat for people who don't know what's going on in them and how fascinating they really are. I guess I myself just thought, wow, it's a bit of an ordinary looking meadow when I started out there, but now I'm a big fan. So and I hope I can bring across some of that enthusiasm tonight. So what is it? In areas that are somewhat sheltered by the coast and that give sediment the possibility to accrete, and we've got mud and sediment building up. We've got the first plants colonizing that sediment, stabilizing it, more and more plants arriving. These first plants that arrive are the so-called pioneer plants, because they go somewhere where no plant has gone before, and then other plants can sort of cluster around them, and this way they can build up a meadow. And you got these vegetated mud flats, basically, with these pioneer plants. And then as you go landwards, they become proper salt marshes, where you find all sorts of different plants that are adapted to living in a saline environment. And this, because it's a coastal environment and because it depends on sediment accreting, it depends a lot on things like how the weather plays out. If we've got a lot of storms, there's going to be a lot of movement. It could be that you visit a salt marsh 1 month and there's 20, 30 meters of salt marsh going out towards the sea, and then there's a huge big winter storm, and the next time you visit there's maybe 5 meters of salt marsh left. So it's a very dynamic environment, a fast-paced environment, which makes it very exciting to study. You've got a lot of small changes as well in what they look like. So there might be a huge creek going through a salt marsh somewhere in one summer. Next summer you come back, this huge creek has for some reason vanished, has collapsed, and there's a huge creek elsewhere now. So it's just a very, very fascinating dynamic environment. It's a place where a lot of exciting wildlife lives, even if, as I said, on first glance, it often just looks like a bit of an ordinary meadow. It's a very important place for a lot of birds to feed, but also to nest. When I was doing my research, there was a part of marsh where we couldn't go because of the ground nesting birds. So that's very important to consider if you yourself have salt marshes nearby, and if you use them recreationally, that there are a lot of animals using these salt marshes as well, and the ground nesting birds especially, something to look out for. When we look at salt marshes in the UK, we see that it is a very common habitat. We find them almost everywhere around the UK coasts. There's about 820 square kilometers of coastal marshes in the UK. However, just because it's a common habitat doesn't mean that it's not a threatened habitat. So a lot of these marshes, first of all, we've already lost a lot of marsh area in the UK. Secondly, a lot of these marsh areas are currently under threat, or they're in not a very good state. But it is a very, very common, typical coastal habitat for the UK, and a very important habitat for a lot of UK wildlife. This is just a picture of a typical salt marsh zonation. So all salt marshes have different zones that we can distinguish because of the plants that grow there. So we've got the mudflat where nothing grows yet. Then we've got the pioneer zone where the pioneer plants grow, the first plants that manage to colonize this very dynamic mud environment. And there are certain typical pioneer plants we're going to find there, like Spartinus or Salicornia. And we've got the lower marsh, where we've got some typical grasses like Puccinellia. That is basically the area where a couple more plants can grow, but these plants still have to be very resistant to flooding because the lower marsh is going to get flooded quite often. We've got the middle marsh where we've got some bigger plants like Festuca or Juncus. Doesn't get flooded quite as often, but still quite regularly. And in the upper marsh, we're slowly going towards terrestrial shrubs. And that only is going to get flooded at spring tides, or just with very extreme weather events. So the plants don't have to be quite as tolerant to saline environments. Now, that whole idea with there's the seaward edge and the landward edge, and I said it's a very dynamic environment, and that means that salt marshes generally move around, and they generally, if the sea sort of pushes at them from the seaward edge, for example, because the sea level is generally rising or because we have more extreme weather events, the marsh is going to retreat landward. And in places where this landward retreat is blocked off, for example, by coastal defenses like a seawall, but also if there's a natural cliff, we're going to get a squeeze of the salt marsh because the sea is going to push at it from the seaward side. And if it's not able to retreat back inland, then the salt marsh area is going to shrink. This habitat is going to get squeezed in, and eventually we're going to lose the salt marsh. So a lot of salt marshes have been lost to coastal defenses because you put a seawall up behind the salt marsh, and that is just going to keep it from migrating inland. And a lot of this land behind the seawalls is often reclaimed agricultural land. And when we have these schemes now that seawalls are actually breached and the marsh is allowed to go back inland, basically, and we allow the land to flood again, that is part of this managed retreat idea of doing coastal protection, not with the hard defenses like seawalls, but using habitats like salt marsh, which are dynamic and which manage to soften the assault of the sea just by being there and breaking the power of the incoming sea, rather than putting a hard structure there which disturbs the natural flow of things and the natural migration of this salt marsh habitat. But anywhere where you see a salt marsh that is kind of fenced in by human structures, you're going to have a situation where eventually we're going to be looking at a loss of this marsh. So I just wanted to say a word about the concept of ecosystem services, which is a very important concept when you're looking at sort of policy development at the moment. It's basically the idea, it's a very anthropocentric idea, because the idea of ecosystem services is that we as humans ask, what can an ecosystem do for us? What does it provide us with? What kind of services does it give us? And because we then can define these services, we can then, for example, put a price tag on these services, and we can say the service is worth X thousands of pounds. And that's why we should be protecting this area, because if we let this area vanish, we're going to lose the services that it provides. So it's a concept that's very useful, especially if you're operating within sort of the capitalist mind frame, but it's also a concept that needs to be critically challenged as well, because it is anthropocentric and it's not about putting a price tag on nature. It's sort of, it helps us value things and it helps operate within the system that we just have at the moment. But just wanted to alert to the fact that it is a concept that's being critically discussed as well. So if you look at ecosystem services provided by coastal marshes, there's a plethora of them. We've got flood protection. So there we see how a marsh can just buffer the effect of severe weather. And if there's, because you would never build houses or any structures really on the marsh, because it's such a dynamic environment. You couldn't live there. So naturally, there's going to be a buffer zone between human settlements and the sea, so it can protect for flooding, because it also breaks the power of the waves, and it just slows everything down. Same thing with the reduction of coastal erosion. It's the same system. It just lessens the power of the assaulting sea. Then it can store a lot of carbon. I'm going to talk about that in detail a little bit further on. It can purify and detoxify water, because the water goes through the soil, and in that process it gets purified and detoxified. There's actually now going to be new research on how far salt marshes are able to filter microplastics. So if microplastics come in from land-based, for example, through a river delta, and they go through a salt marsh, and how far does the salt marsh actually act like as a microplastic sink? So that's very exciting research going on there as well. Then of course it can provide education, because you can take people onto the salt marsh, you can show them what lives there. It's a great place to take groups of school kids, for example, and provide them with a link to nature. It's a cultural effect. Like I said, a very typical habitat around the UK coast. There's a lot of places that are very closely linked to salt marsh. It's an inspiration to artists. So it has a cultural and heritage aspect to it. Of course, recreation. Dog walkers who live close to a salt marsh are going to say, yes, of course, that's where I'll always take my dog. And of course, biodiversity, like I said, a lot of important for a lot of different animals and plants. And of course, provisioning as well of food, and if you want to eat something like that, which I wouldn't, but it's just one of the ecosystem services that we have to list. And I'm going to talk about the carbon aspect of things, the mightiness of the coastal wetlands. And just a short reminder of something that we all know: the global monthly average carbon dioxide concentration has been going up, 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 up. This is starting in 1980 here, up to about 2020. So we see it's a clear upwards trend. Carbon dioxide is responsible probably for about 84% of the increase in the carbon trapping capacity of our atmosphere. It's not the most powerful greenhouse gas, but it is the most common one. There's just so much of it. That's why it's so important to somehow get a grip on it. The good news is, of course, we have a lot of natural ways of capturing carbon. We don't have to necessarily look at injecting it into the ground with machines and everything, but we have a lot of ecosystems that take out a lot of carbon. And relatively recently only has the importance of the so-called blue carbon been discussed. So blue carbon is all the carbon that is taken up by marine and coastal ecosystems. So here we've got the salt marshes, the mangroves, and seagrass meadows. And we see, surprisingly perhaps, that the burial rate of carbon in these habitats is much, much higher than in terrestrial forests. So this is how much grams of carbon these habitats bury per square meter per year. So salt marshes are really the absolute top of the class there. And this is the reason why they're so important for this carbon burial, is because most of the carbon in these coastal ecosystems is carbon that's actually in the soil rather than in the living biomass. As you can imagine, in a tropical forest, you're going to have a lot of carbon that's actually stored in the plants, in the living plants, because you have massive plants that have a lot of carbon in them. But in a salt marsh with its little grasses and everything, you have far less carbon in the actual living biomass, and you have far more carbon that's actually stored in the soil. And if you're looking at longer term carbon storage, that's what's really interesting because the carbon that's in the soil is less dynamic. Less of it is going back into the atmosphere, basically. So the deeper it travels down into the soil, the more long-term it's going to be stored. And that's what mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrass meadows all have in common, that they have a huge amount of the carbon that they store is actually soil organic carbon. Another thing that's great about salt marshes is that because of the salinity of the earth, they are not a big emitter of methane, which is a very, very powerful greenhouse gas. And that's the problem with peatlands. Peatlands emit potentially a lot of methane, which then kind of cancels out some of the good effect they have for carbon capture, because then they're bad again because they release methane. But because of the more saline earth in salt marshes, the methane production is inhibited. So they don't have that problem. There's two types of carbon that ends up in salt marshes. There's the normal atmospheric carbon that comes in through photosynthesis and the plants capture out of the atmosphere. But there's also the carbon that comes in through carbon that's already dissolved in the water, little particles that are dissolved in the water and that are then trapped by the plants in the salt marsh and then settle out into the soil. So this is the fancy words for these two types of carbons are allochthonous and autochthonous carbon. The allochthonous carbon is the foreign carbon that comes floating in, and the autochthonous carbon is the own carbon that the plants basically capture themselves. And both types of this carbon then go into the salt marsh soils. In my research, I looked at different drivers of carbon store. So I was interested in what do we have to look at in order to be able to understand how the carbon storage in salt marshes works, what different drivers influence it, where do we have to focus our research if we, for example, want to predict carbon storage capacity of a certain marsh area, if we, for example, want to put a price tag on it and say this area could potentially capture X tons of carbon and that would be worth so and so many millions of pounds in carbon credits. That would be one reason why we would want to predict how much carbon an area could potentially be storing. So I was looking at elevation relative to the tidal range. I was looking at sediment properties like grain size and porosity, because since the carbon is in the soil and is exposed to soil processes, we figured it would be important to look at the sediment properties and how that reacts. pH and salinity, because that influences the chemistry of the ground. Depth into soil. So in the closer to the roots of the plants, there's obviously going to be more carbon, but how does the rate of carbon change if we go deeper down into the soil? And then the plant communities as well, because different plants have different rates of carbon capture, how much carbon they actually take out of the atmosphere and how efficient they are at it, basically. So that's some of the drivers that I looked at. I looked at different marshes across the UK, one in Wales, two up in Morecambe Bay, and one in the northeast, close to the Wash. Yeah, meadows. My family was very surprised that that's what a marine biologist would be doing. But yeah, meadows, cows. Not even in Germany. There's manatees are called sea cows, but these are not even sea cows. These are just marsh cows. That was our really quickly just how, so you can imagine how this whole research worked. We set up a sampling transect from the mudflat all the way up to the terrestrial edge of the marsh. We had our sampling quadrats where we sampled what kind of plants grow there, and did a description of the general area. And then we had these wonderful plastic cores that were at the heart of what we were doing, where we sampled the earth in the marsh, because we of course need to not only sample it from the surface, but we really wanted to go deep down. And interestingly, a lot of the data that was available before our research was relatively shallow data, so down to about 30, 40 centimeters. We actually went down between 1 meter and 120 with these cores. So we got some very deep data there. Very basic research, sledgehammer, plastic cores, hitting it in with the sledgehammer, very physical way of working, but the cows were always cheering us on. So that was that made it a bit better. And then what we ended up with were these wonderful cores. Some of them unfortunately broke, which is why not in all places did we have the full depth, but we got a lot of really nice cores. And what you can here already see when you cut them is that we have a very strong layering. If you look at the color of the sediment, you can already see that it's a dynamic environment. There have definitely been changes over the years. There's different colors of earth, different types of earth as well. Some is more sandy, some is more muddy. So you can definitely see that this is going to lead to varied carbon storage capacities as well. And that's just some of the stuff we did then in the lab, just to show just all the wonderful things you can do with a bit of mud. It's basically baking mud cakes, but professionally. So it's like what we all did when we were 5 years old, but just on a whole different level. This is a very typical vertical soil carbon profile we got from this. So we see there's high levels of carbon high up, close to the root material in the humic zone of the earth, which is what we would be expecting. But then as we go down into the core, the carbon is less and less because a lot of it is broken down by bacteria. It goes back into the atmosphere. So this carbon up there is is not very stable yet. It's not in there for a long time. But then the more you go down, you see the amount of carbon then doesn't decrease as massively anymore. Once you're sort of below 50 centimeters, it becomes more of a straight line. And that's the carbon that we're really interested in, the deep storage carbon, the carbon that's really locked up in the sediment for a long time. And then another interesting thing when you're trying to predict how much carbon could be in a marsh is stratification, because the environment is so dynamic. So this is an example of a very strongly stratified core where we see there's some dark earth up there, then there's some more sandy, lighter earth, and then there's dark earth again at about 40 centimeters depth. And there we find that there was also a lot more carbon in this 40 centimeters depth than we would expect from the normal curve. And that's because this is actually, if we go in time travel without even using a DeLorean, just using a plastic tube, we can see that what happened here is that we're up in 2021. We have the current salt marsh looking like a meadow. We have very dark brown earth, which is very humic, very rich, lots of carbon in it. If we go 10 centimeters down, that would be about the year 1963. We see it's dark brown earth. This is already a salt marsh. If you had come to this area in the 60s, it would have looked pretty much like it does now. Then going back in time, 40 centimeters. So there are different ways of aging these cores. I'm just going with one paper where they were reconstructing sort of accumulation history of salt marshes in different ways. And I'm just following that one type of aging, but it's all more or less concordant with one another. So at 40 centimeters, we'd be around the year 1800. We see the sediment is lighter than up there, which means it's probably marine sediment. It's far more sandy, which means at that time in the 1800s, this area was flooded. So you wouldn't have seen a meadow there. You would have just seen water had you come to visit it. And then at around 50 centimeters, around year 1700, we see the darker sediment again. And this would mean that this is probably old salt marsh, which means, as I said, very dynamic environment. And at this time, there was a salt marsh there. And that's why there's earth down there, which has far more carbon, because this is basically the old root level that we have there. So we have a lot of, almost as much carbon stored at 40, 50 centimeter depth than we have at the current root level, which means that if we're trying to predict the carbon storage capacity of a certain marsh. And if it's not a marsh that's been newly created, but if it's an old marsh, it's very helpful to know the history of the marsh in order to be able to find out these kind of things, if there might be a deep carbon storage in that marsh that we should be aware of. And then if you go further down, about the year 1600, at 60 centimeters, you've got again the lighter sediment, which is again possibly, very probably marine, because it's sandy sediment. You would often also find shell fragments in there. So it's clearly, again, the area has been flooded. So that's how you time travel with a plastic tube. And the bottom line was that we did see that the most important drivers of soil carbon density were elevation and pH. If we were looking at the root layers of 0 to 15 centimeters, where we have the most carbon, we saw that the higher up in the marsh we went, the more carbon there was, not surprisingly, because the more plants there are, also the bigger the plants are. So that's just because more plants mean they put more carbon into the soil. However, interestingly, if we looked and compared the cores from the mudflats to the cores from higher up in the marsh, if you went past a certain depth, the mudflat cores and the marsh cores actually didn't vary a lot in how much carbon was in them, which means the mudflats shouldn't be underestimated as far as that they also can hold quite a lot of carbon. And the most important sediment drivers when you went lower down than 15 centimeters were always the sediment properties, which meant, interestingly, that what is really important there is the geology of the place. So the geology, the basic geology of a place will be what determines in a lot of ways how much carbon will be stored in a certain marsh. So it's important to know about the underlying geology, not only about the newly accreted marsh, but also about the general sediment properties in that area will tell you about the carbon storage of these marshes. And that is all from this presentation, and this little plover is saying thank you. And I'm going to stop my screen share now. Thank you very much for being here tonight and listening to me waffling on about salt marshes.